My husband was secretly killing my houseplants to control and manipulate me in our relationship. My love for houseplants is something I've carried with me for as long as I can remember. Growing up, my mother was the kind of person who found joy in the simple, living beauty of plants. Our home was like a small indoor jungle. Lush greenery cascading from hanging baskets, broad-leafed ferns tucked into corners, and flowering vines climbing trellises along the windows. To her, plants weren't just a hobby. They were her solace. She would hum softly to herself as she repotted a stubborn philodendron or trimmed yellowing leaves from a struggling pothose. Her hands, though weathered from years of gardening, moved with a kind of gentle precision that could only come from love. I remember sitting on the floor next to her as a child, my tiny fingers in the soil as I helped her repot her prized monstera. She would talk to me about the importance of understanding a plant's needs, their light, water, and even the love you gave them. Plants are like people, she once said. They thrive when you pay attention to them. When she passed away, caring for plants became more than just a hobby for me. It became a way to stay connected to her. Every time I brought a new plant into my home, I felt like I was continuing her legacy, keeping a piece of her alive in the leaves and roots I nurtured. As I grew older, my passion for plants only deepened. When I moved into my first apartment, I filled it with greenery. Despite the cramped space and poor lighting, I managed to create a small oasis. Friends who visited would often comment on how cozy and inviting my place felt, and I would smile, knowing my mother would have been proud. When my husband and I moved into our current townhome, I was thrilled to finally have a sunroom, a space flooded with natural light, perfect for housing my growing collection. Over the years, I've added rare plants to my collection, like a fiddle-leaf fig that's now taller than me and a variegated peace lily that blooms every spring. Each plant has its own story. Some were gifts, like the Monstera albo my sister gave me for my birthday, a stunning, five-leafed beauty that I had been dreaming about for years. Others were rescues I found on sale at garden centers, neglected and in need of care. Bringing them back to life felt like a small triumph, a reminder of the resilience in all living things. My plants are more than just decoration. They're companions in a way, filling my home with life and color. When I'm feeling stressed, I find peace in tending to them, trimming dead leaves, wiping down their broad green surfaces, and watching new growth unfurl. My sunroom has become my sanctuary. It's the place where I drink my morning coffee, surrounded by the quiet rustle of leaves. It's where I go when I need a moment to myself, a place to reflect and feel grounded. For me, these plants are a connection to my mother, a source of joy, and a symbol of growth. I've always felt that taking care of them is like taking care of a part of myself, something living, growing, and needing attention. That's why, when they started to die, I couldn't ignore the deep sadness it brought me. About 6 months ago, I noticed something unusual. A few of my plants started wilting unexpectedly. At first, I didn't think much of it. Plants sometimes go through rough patches, and even the most experienced gardener loses a few along the way. But these weren't just isolated cases. One by one, healthy plants started to deteriorate. Their leaves yellowed and fell off, their stems turned soft, and before I knew it, they were beyond saving. It wasn't just one or two. It felt like a third of my collection was dying, and I couldn't figure out why. I went through every possibility in my head. Was I overwatering? Underwatering? Was there a hidden pest infestation? I even checked for root rot, pulling plants from their pots to inspect their roots. Nothing made sense. Everything about their care was consistent: light, water, fertilizer, but the plants were still dying. I tried to stay positive. It wasn't any of my most valuable or sentimental plants, so I told myself to let it go. Plants die sometimes, I reminded myself. It's part of life. But as more plants began to wither, the nagging feeling that something was wrong grew stronger. I couldn't shake the idea that there was a missing piece to this puzzle, something I hadn't considered yet. I just didn't know what it was. Things came to a head 2 months ago when my sister gifted me a Monstera albo for my birthday. If you're into houseplants, you know how special this plant is. Its white variegation makes it stand out, and it's not just beautiful, it's rare and expensive. My sister had gone out of her way to find this one for me, knowing how much I'd always wanted it. The moment I unwrapped it, I was in awe. It had 5 pristine, variegated leaves, each one more stunning than the last. I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not just for the plant itself, but for the thoughtfulness behind the gift. I placed it in a prominent spot in my sunroom, where it could soak up the perfect amount of filtered light. I cared for that plant like it was a prized possession. I used distilled water, made sure the soil was well-draining, and checked on it daily. For weeks, it thrived. New leaves began to unfurl, and I felt a sense of pride watching it grow. One morning, I noticed something was off. A few of the monstera's leaves were starting to yellow, and the stems looked slightly droopy. I immediately sprang into action, adjusting the watering schedule and checking the soil for any signs of overwatering or root rot. But the decline was shockingly fast. Within days, the plant had gone from looking healthy and vibrant to lifeless. Its leaves turned brown and crispy at the edges, and the stems started to soften. It didn't make sense. I'd followed every rule in the book, given it the best care I could. I tried not to panic, telling myself I could save it if I acted quickly enough. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Desperate for answers, I decided to unpot the monstera to inspect its roots. I carefully removed it from its pot, gently shaking off the soil. I was expecting to find some obvious sign of trouble, maybe root rot or pests. Instead, I noticed something else. A faint chemical smell hit me as I sifted through the soil. At first, I couldn't place it, but as I sniffed closer, it became unmistakable: bleach. I felt my heart drop. Bleach? How could that even be possible? I knew I hadn't added anything like that to the soil. The only other person in the house who had access to my plants was my husband. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I spent the rest of the day feeling numb, replaying the discovery in my mind over and over. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe there was some kind of mix-up. Maybe it wasn't what I thought it was. When I finally had the chance to talk to my husband that evening, I was careful to stay calm. I didn't want to accuse him outright, but I needed answers. "Have you done something to my plants?" I asked, looking him straight in the eye. At first, he denied it. He acted surprised, almost offended by the question, but I didn't back down. "I found bleach in the soil of my monstera. The only person who could have put it there is you." That's when his facade crumbled. He admitted to it. He told me he'd been adding small amounts of bleach to the fertilizer water I prepared for my plants. I was stunned. I could barely find the words to ask him why. Why would he do something so cruel? He knew how much my plants meant to me, how they were a connection to my mother. His response was vague and unsatisfying. He didn't offer a real explanation, nor did he apologize. He just stood there, avoiding my gaze, as though what he'd done was no big deal. After my husband admitted to sabotaging my plants, I felt like the air had been knocked out of me. This wasn't just about dead plants anymore. This was about betrayal. I had always trusted him. We'd been together for years, shared a life, and even had a child together. The realization that he could do something so deliberate and cruel left me questioning everything I thought I knew about him. That night, I couldn't bear to sleep in the same room as him. I took a blanket and a pillow and moved to the trundle bed in my daughter's room. Lying there, staring at the ceiling, my mind raced with questions. Why did he do it? Was it some petty grudge? Had I done something to upset him without realizing it? And if he could harm something I loved so much, was I or my daughter next? The thought made my stomach churn. I tried to reason with myself, telling myself that he wasn't violent, that he'd never hurt us. But the act of poisoning my plants felt like a warning, a message that he could take away something I cherished whenever he wanted. The next day, I gave myself space to think. I avoided him as much as possible, taking time to reflect on the situation. I couldn't shake the feeling that his actions were about more than just the plants. My sunroom had always been my sanctuary. It was my space, filled with the plants that brought me peace and joy. He never had a reason to go in there. His office, his gaming setup, and his hobbies were in a completely different part of the house. And yet, he had deliberately gone into my space, tampered with something I loved, and watched as I struggled to figure out what was happening. The fact that he didn't even try to deny it for long spoke volumes. When I asked him why he did it, his lack of remorse or explanation left me reeling. How could someone who claimed to love me act so callously? I decided to text him later that day. I thought he might be more open to explaining himself in writing since he often found it easier to communicate that way. I kept my message simple. "I need to understand why you did this. What were you trying to accomplish?" His response came quickly, and it was as cold as it was shocking. "You deserve to be knocked down a peg." Those words haunted me. What had I done to deserve this in his eyes? I wasn't perfect, but I didn't think I'd ever acted superior to him. If anything, I'd always tried to support him, to give him his own space and respect his interests. His words felt like an attack on my character, an attempt to undermine my confidence and make me doubt myself. This wasn't just about plants, it was about control. The more I thought about it, the more pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place. His behavior over the past year had been increasingly erratic. He'd become more critical, more dismissive of my interests, and quicker to anger. There were little things I had brushed off at the time, like his snide comments about how much time I spent caring for my plants, or the way he seemed annoyed whenever my sister and I talked about gardening. I'd assumed he was just stressed or tired, but now I saw it in a different light. This wasn't a random act of sabotage. It was part of a larger pattern, a way for him to assert control over me and make me feel small. I felt my chest tighten with a mix of anger and heartbreak. This wasn't just about the plants, it was about trust. If he could do this, what else was he capable of? By the following day, the unease I felt had grown unbearable. My husband's admission about the plants and his chilling comment that I deserved to be knocked down a peg played over and over in my mind. I couldn't ignore the possibility that there was more to his behavior than I realized. For years, I had respected his personal space in our home. His office was his sanctuary, just as my sunroom was mine. I never went in there, not even to grab dirty dishes. But now, the nagging voice in the back of my mind wouldn't let me rest. I needed to know if there was something I was missing. I waited until he was out of the house before I entered his office. Standing in the doorway, I felt a pang of guilt for violating his privacy, but I reminded myself of everything that had happened. He had already betrayed my trust, and my instincts told me that this wasn't the whole story. The room was just as I'd expected, cluttered with gaming gear, stacks of papers, and random knickknacks. At first glance, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but as I started looking closer, opening drawers and rifling through his desk, I found something that made my stomach churn. In one of the lower drawers, tucked beneath a pile of old receipts, I found a stash of my daughter's toys. There were tiny pieces of furniture from her dollhouse, a few dolls, and other small trinkets she loved. These were the very items she'd been heartbroken over losing. Every time one of her toys went missing, he was the one who noticed and pointed it out. I'd always thought he was just being observant, maybe a little overly critical. He'd scold her about taking better care of her things, often to the point of making her cry. But now, I realized it wasn't carelessness on her part. He had been taking her things deliberately and hiding them away. I sat on the floor of his office, holding one of my daughter's dolls, and the weight of what I discovered hit me like a tidal wave. He hadn't just been sabotaging my plants. He had been using these small acts to control and manipulate both me and our daughter. When I thought about how often I had stepped in to comfort her after one of his lectures, I felt sick. I'd assumed he was losing his patience, but now I saw it for what it was. A deliberate attempt to make her feel inadequate and dependent on him. The realization was both infuriating and heartbreaking. How could someone I trusted, someone I thought I knew, be capable of such calculated cruelty? I knew I couldn't wait any longer to act. This wasn't just about the plants or even the toys. This was about creating a safe and healthy environment for my daughter and me. I called my sister, explained everything, and asked her to come over with her husband and father-in-law. Together, we changed the locks on the house. It felt surreal watching them work, knowing that my marriage had reached a point where this was necessary. Before he could return home, I sent him a text. "You're not welcome here anymore. You can come on Saturday to collect your essentials, but you will be supervised. Do not contact me except to arrange this." In the hours after he left, I felt a mix of emotions, relief, anger, and a deep sadness for what had been lost. This wasn't the life I'd envisioned when I married him. But now that I saw the full picture, I knew there was no going back. He had shown me who he truly was, not just in how he treated me, but in how he treated our daughter. His actions weren't just hurtful, they were dangerous. I don't know what his motivations were, and I'm not sure I ever will. But one thing is certain. I can't allow someone like that to remain in my life or in my child's life. When the locks were changed and the house was quiet again, I sat down in the sunroom, surrounded by the plants that were still alive. For the first time in days, I allowed myself to exhale. The weight of everything that had happened was almost too much to process. My marriage was over, my trust shattered, and the father of my child had shown a side of himself I never could have imagined. But as I sat there, I realized that this moment wasn't just an ending. It was also a beginning. My first priority was, and always will be, my daughter. As painful as this situation was, I knew I had made the right choice by removing him from our home. The thought of her living in an environment where she was manipulated and emotionally tormented made my decision clear. I spent hours reflecting on the times she had cried because of her lost toys, the way he had scolded her for something he had orchestrated. It wasn't just cruel, it was calculated, a way to undermine her sense of security and confidence. Now, my focus is on helping her heal. I want her to grow up feeling safe, loved, and valued. I've already started making changes at home, reorganizing her playroom, replacing the missing pieces from her dollhouse, and creating an atmosphere where she can thrive. The sunroom, which had once felt like my sanctuary, had become a place of sorrow over the past 6 months. As I looked at the remaining plants, I felt a pang of guilt for the ones I had lost, especially the Monstera albo from my sister. But I also realized that the sunroom was still mine. The plants that survived were a testament to resilience, not just theirs, but mine as well. Over the next few days, I began to reclaim the space. I cleaned the shelves, repotted the remaining plants, and bought a few new ones to replace those that were gone. It was a small act, but it felt empowering. I wasn't going to let his actions take away something that brought me so much joy. If there's one thing this experience has taught me, it's the importance of having people you can rely on. My sister has been my rock through all of this. She and her husband didn't hesitate to step in and help when I needed them most. I've also started opening up to close friends about what's happened. At first, I was hesitant. I didn't want to burden anyone or feel judged. But the more I shared, the more I realized how much support I had. People who genuinely care about you will show up when you need them, even if you're not sure how to ask. This experience has been a painful wake-up call, but it's also taught me some invaluable lessons. I've learned to trust my instincts, even when it feels uncomfortable. The unease I felt about my plants dying was my intuition trying to tell me something was wrong. I've also learned that love isn't always enough to sustain a relationship. Trust, respect, and shared values are just as important. Without them, even the strongest foundation will crumble. But perhaps the biggest lesson I've learned is that I'm stronger than I thought. Facing the truth about my husband and taking the steps to protect myself and my daughter wasn't easy, but it was necessary. I don't know exactly what the future holds, but I feel hopeful for the first time in a while. My priority now is creating a safe, loving home for my daughter and building a life that reflects the values I want to pass on to her. The path ahead won't be easy. There will be legal battles, difficult conversations, and moments of doubt. But I know I'm on the right track. For anyone reading this who might be in a similar situation, trust yourself. If something feels wrong, don't ignore it. You have the strength to make the changes you need, even if it feels impossible in the moment.